biggest risk factors for developing downstream atherosclerosis and heart disease and having a heart attack in the future is high blood pressure. And one of the main drivers for high blood pressure is excess sodium in our diet. Based on the data that we have of chronic disease correlation, we know that eating in excess of, let's say, 2,300 to 3,000 milligrams of sodium a day, which is about a teaspoon of salt, is where you start to see a strong correlation to high blood pressure and downstream heart disease.
Well, Dr. Rose, welcome to the podcast show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. And you can call me Gabe.
So tell us about your journey into medicine. Like, what was your kind of like interest, your passion, your decisions to go into the medical field?
Of course, sure. So actually, it was sort of a strange journey because I started off more so in music, which I had done all my life from an early age up until through college. And in college, I think it was the crossroads that I came upon where I decided to keep music something more for recreation as opposed to professional, and decide on a journey that was away from what I had grown up with and what I'd seen my parents and other family members sort of struggle with all their lives. And I think that medicine came about because I really connected with science in undergraduate school. I did really well in biology and biochemistry and organic chemistry, and I really loved it. I felt like it was easier for me, ironically, than some of the things that were more in the liberal arts side, like English and anthropology, etc. But what I knew was that I didn't want to be a sort of lab rat. I didn't like the idea of experimentation in a lab bench setting and just kind of not interacting with other people and having that variety that I still somehow craved in life. And so as I got more and more into college and connecting with different types of classes, I realized that I started to enjoy physical exercise, activity, things like going to the gym with my friends, getting in better shape. And I thought that medicine would kind of marry those two things really well, the sciences and the human aspect. And so I started to apply for medical school and, eventually found my way into medicine. And it's been a really interesting journey. I went into osteopathic school, which teaches you not only traditional modern medicine, but also other tenets of medicine that aren't really taught in the more traditional allopathic setting, like hands-on manipulation and thinking about the body as a whole for, various disease states. And that kind of piqued my curiosity and other things like nutrition, as I was kind of making my way through residency and later on as an attending. And that's kind of how I am where I am today as a physician. I work in emergency medicine, and it's a busy field. And the problem with emergency medicine is that we are sort of pressured to go from one exam room to another, from one patient case to another, in an expedited fashion. Because if you spent a lot of time with one person individually, while it's great, the downside is that you have a busy department that continues to mount more and more cases behind you. And that pressure can start to get overwhelming if things pile up too much. And sometimes you just have no choice because a very sick patient indeed might come through the doors and you have to run and see them. And so what I felt was lacking in my practice was that ability to talk to my patients about the things that we leave more so for the primary care physicians, which is, what are you eating? How's your diet? How are things going on these medications? In emergency medicine, it's more just kind of focusing on the acute issue rather than the more chronic stuff and the preventative care. So I think I'm maybe jumping ahead here, but I think that's kind of how I branched out into social media. I've had ideas to talk about the things that I do personally and all the things that I learned, not only in medical school, but through practice and through my own sort of lifestyle trial and error of achieving optimal health. I wanted to be in better shape. I wanted to live long. I wanted to slow down aging. I wanted to prevent some of the quote unquote inevitables that come with genetics from things that afflicted my parents that I knew that I one day would be doomed to. So all the things that I picked up from practice, from reading, from researching, I thought I wanted to share with people because I didn't have time to do that at work necessarily. I was just under so much pressure and constraint. And I think that's how I started my channel. I just wanted to talk about those topics that we don't really get a chance to during the ER visit.
You covered a lot of interesting aspects in your journey into medicine. It was a short snippet, which is quite good. Definitely want to get more into talks about ER medicine, but I'd like to just go back to when you started into medicine. Did you grow up with family or any people in your family who are physicians or within the medical health profession?
So I did not. I'm actually the first physician for my family on both sides. And it just kind of what I was alluding to before, I came from a very artistic family. My parents were musicians, artists. My mom was an opera singer in her early years. She also played and taught piano. She went to a music academy. My father played drums in a band when he was younger, and then he went to school for drafting and illustration. And that was reflected in me throughout my entire early childhood, all the way up to college. I was pursuing music, and my brothers both went on to an artistic profession. My younger brother is an actor and big on social media, and my older brother is actually an artist and does illustration and graphic design. So I'm really the first person in my family from anywhere to go and pursue medicine.
Yeah. I just wanted just to touch on that. Just anyone who's listening, who's trying to get into med school, just to get some inspiration, because you kind of think that people who get in med school, I mean, yes, or majority of people who perhaps do, and they're quite bright. I mean, because you're competing, you need high MCAT scores, you need a good GPA. So it's obviously quite difficult, but you don't know each individual struggle. There are probably people who aren't so good, but they work extra hard, long hours just to get those grades. I mean, what's your kind of view on that from your personal experience getting into med school?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that you have to have a reason for doing it. And if that reason is strong enough, if you're motivated enough for wanting to do what it is that you want to do, you're going to find a way to connect with the material and you're going to feel an urgency about studying. So, for example, if you really want to, so I didn't really ever prepare myself early on for anything in academics. I just was more interested in playing guitar and, going to orchestra practice and listening to music. And so when it came time to getting into a good college, and then of course, when it came time to getting a strong score in the MCATs and applying for medical school, the competition was a little bit overwhelming because I felt like I was at a disadvantage from years and years of not caring or not really thinking about it. So really, I mean, what it came down to was a lot of sleepless nights in undergraduate and a lot of catching up in my last 2 years of high school. And I think what was motivating me was the idea that there was something that I really wanted to prove, not only to myself, but to my family and friends. But I think especially towards the MCATs and in college, I developed my own strategy, which was I just didn't want to see myself fail. I felt like I'd carried myself so far in towards this pursuit of medicine. I just didn't want to see myself as a failure. And so that would motivate me to stay up sometimes all night, a couple, maybe 3 times a week. And I feel like you can do that a lot easier when you're 18 years old than now, much older. But, that really forced me to read the material with a sense of urgency. So I think that's my advice, is that if you could find a connection when you're doing, when you're reading material for an exam or when you're trying to figure out, how to approach studying, it's that you have to have a sense of purpose to that. And if you don't have that why that's motivating you, then it's going to be very hard to retain those concepts and that knowledge and do well in exams, because I feel like it's just going to be dry reading and you're looking at dry material that otherwise you have no emotional connection to. And I think that's what I was able to do, is create an emotional connection to the material.
And did you have like a technique for studying? Did you actually write notes, or did you just kind of read highlights from books? Like, what was your kind of method or technique?
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of many different styles of studying. And a lot of it, again, is trial and error. But in certain classes, like I would say specifically, let's say like biochemistry, which is really just fact and detail oriented you have to describe certain enzymes and molecular processes. I think what I would do is I would reread the chapters over and over, literally up to like minutes before the test, so that it was super fresh in my mind. And I think today we just call that cramming. And it worked to an extent for the short term, but I couldn't tell you 85 to 90% of the things, now like years later, because I just did it in a very rote fashion. I think the studying that I did and developed later on that was most effective, that I used in my last years of college and how I studied and did well for the MCAT specifically and through medical school, is I adapted a more sort of storytelling approach to style. There's many different forms of this. There's many different terms for this, like memory palace technique. But the idea is that you want to use a visual interpretation of the material to make it stick, to make it personal to you, and so that you never forget it. So for example, when I was studying for the MCATs, I would use visual techniques. I would create a story out of the material, and I would make it very weird and radical, sometimes very extreme. And it became such a vivid, sort of weird portrayal of what I was trying to learn that it just something that would never escape me. And I could probably still talk about a majority of the material today, years later. Other things that worked for me in terms of study techniques was, and I think this is, I've had to describe this to people I've mentored in the past who are either getting into medical school or going through medical school and residency. And that is, you have to really just be honest with yourself. And what I mean by that is, when I studied for the MCAT, I took Kaplan, which is a famous test prep company. And I remember I struggled with some of the early physics that I had to use for the test. And I decided that I would just get a bunch of material, including whatever Kaplan gave you. And I would read it in a sense that I thought that I was going to have to get up and teach it to the entire class the next day. And unless you can read something and then say, I'm going to teach this to somebody who has no idea what is going on here, or somebody who's like a sixth grader, then I really don't understand the material. And that's the exact approach that I took when I became a Kaplan teacher the year after I took the MCAT. And I taught it for like 3 or 4 years. And the approach that I tried to instill in my students was go home, look at this stuff, and be able to come back tomorrow and explain it to the whole class. And I never actually put anybody in front of the classroom, but that's the mentality that you need to have. And, whether it is finding your own way to do it or using memory palace or visualization, or taking copious notes. I think everybody's a little bit more individual in how they learn best. But if you take that mentality going into an exam, then that's going to make you really face yourself and be honest with yourself of whether you know what you're doing or not when it comes to the material. And that's how I kind of created those memory techniques, is because I wanted to be able to teach what it was that I was learning to somebody else. And so if you can take a concept that's complicated and distill it down to something in a nutshell, which is a very popular term, but it actually makes a lot of sense. You package it into your own little story, your own little frame of mind, and you can relay that to somebody very simply. You create a clearer message out of it. And I think that's what works best for me.
Yeah, I was just kind of going back into my past and just kind of thinking about the times when I was in my clinical years when I had to explain conditions to patients we have Viva exams, which are clinical exams. And I remember sometimes I was actually overcomplicating some of the pathology, some of the diagnosis to patients or diseases. And I remember one of my mentors said, you're overcomplicating everything. You need to make it more layman terms just to explain it to them. You're actually going straight into it. Plantar fasciitis or it's Morton's neuroma. They don't know what that is. You need to break it down and explain it in layman's terms. Did you kind of experience that as well when you were kind of faced with patients or in your clinical exams?
Yes, I think that's a great example because that's something that we're doing every day now, right? We're explaining complicated medical concepts to people who don't understand medicine. And so, to really understand the pathology and the treatment is to be able to take that complicated concept and structure down to somebody who can really understand it. And yes, I would say absolutely. I use that every day. And I think that in residency, I kind of, when I was in training, you would have to teach your juniors, and sometimes you would get medical student rotators, and they would task you with teaching them something, teach them about appendicitis, teach them about, congestive heart failure. And unless you really understood it and made it your own, it was going to be very hard to explain that broad, complicated concept to somebody who is a beginner learner.
And what about reading published journals, papers, being able to critically evaluate them? Did you learn any of that when you were in med school or even afterwards?
Yeah, they do teach you that in medical school, but I feel like it gets lost on a lot of people because quite honestly, it's very dry to read through a lot of medical, peer-reviewed journals and literature. It's just a lot of statistics and statistical language that I'm still not, I wouldn't describe myself as a statistician, and there's a lot of it that I just don't understand. But that's why, the majority of physicians, including myself, who do medical research, we have usually an arsenal of biostatisticians who crunch the numbers for us and put it through that complicated stuff so that we don't have to, because it really does take an intimate knowledge of stats to be able to do that. But, critically reading through papers is an art form. I think that is continuously evolving. I try to get better and better at every single year. And we do journal clubs with, my fellows that I train, every few weeks, and we have to read through papers and, that evaluation process. I think it's a skill that you continue to whittle and fine tune over years and years of practice.
Yeah, because I see on TikTok, you'll see some celebrity or famous doctors who are becoming famous now. They bring research papers into the videos, and then when I look at it, I'm like, that's actually a poor paper. The population that they took was quite a small. It wasn't representation of a big population of the US, or they failed to actually take into consideration that some of these people who were in the trial had conditions beforehand already, which were like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, which would perhaps constitute to bias in the results at the end. And I think it's good now because we've got so many people who come in, and then you get reaction videos with people stitch onto and explain. So I think we're growing on TikTok because even if you put something out, there'll always be someone who would actually have something to add to that. Have you found that as well coming onto TikTok?
100%. Yeah, no, I think that's an important thing to bring up because I don't know if have you ever heard the expression, Ram, a little bit of knowledge can be very dangerous. So basically, people will. So let's say, you can break this up into different categories. Let's say you have somebody who is not a physician or not a licensed practitioner, doesn't have a medical or doctorate degree. They might get their hands on either a paper itself and read it and not really be able to, critically interpret it, and then just come to the same conclusions as the author, which may be very biased. For example, it could be a paper about, the risks, or let's say the benefits of energy drinks, right? Which was one of the things I posted about before. And, that paper might have been written by authors who were, in financial conflicts of interest with the different industry or company that creates these drinks. And they don't really understand that when they read the paper, or it might be a paper that had maybe 20 healthy subject volunteers, and you can't really draw a lot of large sweeping conclusions based on a paper that was done with 15, 20 people. But, to the untrained eye, that paper might say some kind of drastic conclusion that the person now touts to all their friends and on social media as some sort of miracle. Another example is, other than, industry sponsored bias is, I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, it's, you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Every paper you read, no matter what journal, that's the other thing I want to say is that, some journals are more reputable than others, right? If you're reading something in the New England Journal of Medicine, let's say, which is one of the highest impact factor journals in medicine that we know, that publication probably has a little bit more weight or clout than maybe some obscure publication that's published in, I don't know, the Southern Angola, Journal of Clinical Medicine and Practice for Medical Imaging and associations or something. Just there's so many medical journals out there nowadays, and some of them are pay to play, so you can actually pay the publisher to publish your paper. So it really depends on where is the journal coming from, how big was the sample size, were the authors of the paper free of conflict, meaning that they weren't paid by some kind of sponsor or industry, and I think that having a doctor degree and having experience reading a lot of papers every single week gives you a little bit more of a fine-tuned eye towards that type of critical thinking rather than somebody who just doesn't understand. And that's the issue with going online and getting a lot of your information just by Google, because you have people who claim to be experts that selectively pick out certain papers out of the whole consortium of papers on a topic. And, that's called selection bias. So they'll take a paper that points to the conclusions that are in favor with their opinion, but they leave out the 50 other papers that point away from the conclusions in their opinion that favor their opinion. And so, there's a lot of difficulty in getting the right information online. And I think that's one of the things I'm just trying to do sometimes in my posts is just list some papers to back up something that I might say, because, I just want to make sure that people understand sometimes my opinion is based on evidence and not just pure anecdote.
But I think you've got a good sort of like overview and background in terms of reading a paper. I mean, some papers are not qualitative. They can be also qualitative. So there's no numbers there. It's more, obviously those papers are looked kind of in quality wise, slightly below something that's quantitative. But still it's valuable. But it's important because you need to take into consideration when you're making medical treatment decisions or when you're diagnosing a patient, because you need to actually have an idea of what is out there. Like you need to, as a doctor, as a physician, you need to make a clinically informed decision. So it's important to have a background if there's a new sort of update within the literature, the guidelines. But I think as a whole, there's always a team of other physicians and people you work with. So you always, as long as you're employed in a hospital in your speciality, you'll always be around people who will perhaps tell you of the new changes in guidelines, from drug treatments to other treatments.
That's what's really important, right? Now, sometimes, a couple of things to say about that, actually. Sometimes people think that somebody with more gray hair is wiser, but they might be practicing the same way for the past 25 years and not keeping up to date. Whereas somebody who's maybe out of medical school for 5 years would be viewed as an inferior doctor for that reason. But can be quite the opposite of what may be true, right? Somebody who's younger may be more up to speed with the current practices and current guidelines. And it's just a matter of how aggressive you are with keeping up to date. And, we always try to do the best for our patients and practice best evidence medicine. But it's just a matter of A, how good is the evidence, and B, how well you're keeping up to date. And I think that's something that we all strive to do. And certainly we're all required to with CME, continuous medical education. But yes, we always try to do the right thing based on the best available evidence. And that evidence can be strong, it could be moderate, or it can be very weak sometimes. And, it's not to say that there isn't a place for personal practice styles and things that anecdotally worked for you as a physician with your patients. That's where you create your own style of practice with years of experience, things that go beyond just the medical literature, in terms of how you do things. But yes, we try to keep in mind, what the best available evidence is.
Yeah, because there's also clinical based evidence, which is slightly different than reading journals which are published, but you can draw to a conclusion. But what's more interesting is actually doing a diagnostic test with a clinical justification. I think that's something I learned very on when I was training as a podiatrist. And now with TikTok, we see so many people coming in who are not medically trained or qualified, but they come from alternative medicine backgrounds. But I see some of the videos that come up, and I wanted to like get your insight on what you think about the aspect when they talk about things like adrenal fatigue and also leaky gut syndrome.
Well, I think it's no surprise that, especially with the evolution of social media and increasing, information outlets like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and hypeism, I think just taking off in the last 3-4 years. I think the pandemic paved the way for so many good things and bad. And definitely a lot of bad things that you can point out. And one of those things is sort of this pseudoscience or medical faddism that we're witnessing more and more each day. Now, I have to say, I do always appreciate people who try to use social media for expanding and promoting public health awareness and trying to better people's lives. And it's hard for me, there are some people who stitch or comment on videos on TikTok and they just literally destroy the people that they stitched a video with. And I have a hard time doing that because I got to say, it takes a lot of, and I can tell you this personally, it takes a lot of guts, and I'm sure you're aware, to get up and post a video that literally can be viewed by millions of people. It's your face and information out there. And if you're doing it for something with good intention, right? You're not just trying to sell a product. You're not promoted by anybody. You're doing it because you want people to be better. It's hard for me to take somebody like that and tear them apart, and that's why I also at work, we'll get cases that come to us in the emergency room from an office or from another provider in an urgent care setting. And you look at the chart that preceded the patient and their arrival, and you think to yourself, wow, they really botched this, or like, this is definitely not the right approach. But I would never throw any physician under the bus. I mean, unless it was an egregious, error that clearly demonstrated malintent, which I personally, I don't think I've ever seen that. You never, because, sometimes people are just doing the best they can. So I think I want to, make that perfectly clear before I say anything else. But, just to your point about things like leaky gut, I'll be honest, I'm not 100%, very knowledgeable on these topics. I've heard the terms before. It's not something that, I mean, I could just say it's flat out. It's not something that we use as our own diagnoses in medicine, and not things that I treat in my line of work. But I've heard people use these terms. I've heard people say things like, like sweat out your toxins and, go on a juice cleanse and stuff like that. And these are just simply fads, and people, spin words into, either conditions or treatments, and they either don't work and it just ends up being a waste of money, or it's something that can be harmful. And the harm is either in certain products that people either use or misuse, or that they take the face value of something they heard on the internet or from somebody who's not a true practicing medical doctor over the advice of their physician. And I think that's where, I have to draw the line, because it's fine to always seek out other alternatives and other opinions. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But if somebody has some sort of serious medical condition, and they choose to take the word of somebody who claims to be an expert and really just has no idea what they're talking about, or spreading misinformation over the word of their physician, I think that's where it can be dangerous. And I certainly in the last 3 years have seen that since the rise of the pandemic, with either anti-vaxxer mentality or other things, trusted medications that, are repurposed and may or may not work. And so I think that's kind of my opinion on that, is that it's fine to seek out other ideas and opinions. I mean, that's how we learn, and that's how things evolve, even in medicine. But you just have to know, where to draw the line, and you always have to verify your sources, because they're, chiropractors and, other sort of naturopaths who don't have any clinical experience, who are telling people to do crazy things like you have to eat a lot more salt and eat a lot more salt. And, people take things literally and they take it out of context, and then they get themselves hurt. And I think that's where it could be dangerous to trust social media all the time. And I think that's why you see certain doctors post up the clinical evidence for things that they say. It's good, and it's also bad that we have to do that, right? Like, in the old days, people used to take the word of their doctor at face value and to heart, and that's good, and that's also bad, right? Not everybody's right, including myself, and medicine is constantly changing and evolving. But it's also bad because nowadays you can't say anything to people without having to post all your references and all your sources. So, otherwise they try to call you out on it, and it makes the job a little bit more difficult. And while I welcome the challenge, sometimes it could be a little bit exhausting to, say, look, my, 12, however many years of practice of doing this, plus, all the continuous education that I do and all the academia I've been through. And you still believe somebody on YouTube over me. It's kind of difficult.
Yeah. And I also want to say that even there's no such thing as natural, because even if someone says you need magnesium and we're going to sell you magnesium supplements, excessive magnesium still has side effects. The side effects in supplements, and plus some of these things are not FDA approved. So you don't even know what harm it could cause. Whereas some medications, all the medications which we're illegally able to prescribe have gone through FDA approval. So we know what side effects it can cause, what it can treat. So it's even more dangerous. And the aspect of saying that we're treating you naturally as a naturopath is false. And I know this because I had an aunt who was a homeopath back in the UK. Coincidentally, she was also medically qualified. Obviously, she didn't go into her residency because she wanted to start a family. But even those medications, which are homeopathic, they also like drugs. There's no difference because if drugs are made from plant extracts. So what is natural? What isn't natural? And that kind of baffles me.
Yeah, I think that, the lines get blurred a little bit. And, certainly a lot of medications are derived from natural plants and other things found in nature that we use and just either alter a little bit to make it, more commercially available for people to use. A lot of medicines are like that, take like digoxin, right? Which comes from digitalis plant, the foxglove. We have to be clear, all supplements that you buy in a health food store or at CVS or whatever pharmacy you go to, anything you can pick up off the shelf, like, magnesium supplements, herbal stuff, vitamins, none of that is FDA regulated. You can't, some brands are more reliable than others, but you can't really take it at face value in terms of what's on the label, because they're not required by any governmental restrictions to list, exactly how much goes into it. It can be deceiving. And I think that's where, it can be a little bit of a problem. Like you said about magnesium, you can have too much, right? Same with potassium, same with sodium. And so it's complicated. Medicine is an art, and, we try to do things individually for each of our patients, but we also have to try to make some general recommendations. And it's very complicated, especially on social media, to do that. You try to say something about cholesterol, and then you get people who say, cholesterol is important. We need it for our cells in our brain. And I'm like, of course it's important. And yes, we have it in every cell in our body and in our brain. And we all need cholesterol. And that's why our liver produces it. But I think that that's the issue, is that you have, sometimes 60 seconds or 30 seconds to talk about a topic. And then people will take something you say quite literally and just make a broad generalization about it and try to say that you're wrong. And yeah.
I know you put a video up. It was on, I forgot what the title was, but there was a mention of salt on there and it went viral, but you removed it because people were kind of like saying you actually do need salt, but you actually meant excessive salt, like table salt, putting excess salt in your food, because you can't really avoid salt. It's everywhere, even if it's 0.01% in vegetables when you cook it, boil it, basically.
Right. If you think about it evolutionarily, and yes, so I'll refer to that video. So that video, I spoke about ways to lower your blood pressure. I think that was the context of the video. And one of the things that I discussed, which is probably one of the most important topics, at least in the United States, is the overconsumption of salt in the form of sodium. So there's many types of salts, right? Including potassium, but sodium is heavily consumed in this country, far more than many others. And it's no wonder that we have such a large prevalence of high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease here in the United States. And so one of the topics that I brought up was the overconsumption of salt. And I said, we really need to reduce and cut down on salt in our diets. And I said, it's not essential. And I think that, it went viral, and there was a lot of comments saying, okay, this guy's saying that it's sodium or salt is not essential, but we all have a concentration of sodium in our bodies, which is obviously true, and that we need it for everyday functions, which is obviously true. And I don't think I was trying to say that we need zero sodium in our life. I was trying to say that we get it from, eating a balanced, healthy diet. And so eating a lot of processed foods, which is probably the biggest culprit of excess of sodium, and putting a ton of salt in our foods when we cook or go to a restaurant, is adding, 3, 4, sometimes almost tenfold the amount of the recommended dose from all the consensus and guidelines. And so that was the message I was trying to make there about salt itself. And I think that's what's difficult about social media. If we're on the topic, is that you say something and it just really gets taken out of context. So yes, we do take way too much salt in this country. I think the current, AHA, FDA, WHO criteria states anywhere between 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams for a healthy adult of sodium-based salt. And, that's not based on super hard data. We don't really have an RDA, a recommended dietary allowance for salt, for sodium, but based on the data that we have of chronic disease correlation, we know that eating in excess of, let's say, 2,300 to 3,000 milligrams of sodium a day, which is about a teaspoon of salt, is where you start to see a strong correlation to high blood pressure and downstream heart disease. And so that's where I kind of came up with the idea that it's not essential to add salt to your diet. Not saying that sodium is not essential for our life, because I don't think we would be alive, because, in order to make ATP, which is the basic unit of energy in our life, in all of our cells in our living bodies, it comes from the sodium potassium transport pump, which helps to create ATP in our mitochondria. So yes, we do need sodium, but we don't need as much as we think we do. And we could probably do with less in our day-to-day lifestyle habits.
Yeah. And I can see that. I mean, is that one of your areas of interest, cardiovascular disease?
Yes, because, yes, and I can explain that. So number one, it's because I'm an emergency medicine physician, and one of the main things that I treat as bread and butter emergency medicine is chest pain. And chest pain, we always have to concern ourselves with a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. And so the number one, killer of people in this country and probably globally is heart disease. And so, one of the biggest risk factors for developing downstream atherosclerosis and heart disease and having a heart attack in the future is high blood pressure. And one of the main drivers for high blood pressure is excess sodium in our diet. So, it's an important health issue for me, not only because I see so many patients with high blood pressure. It's almost the norm. It's kind of rare to have patients with perfect blood pressure nowadays, but also because, it affects my family. High blood pressure runs in my family, in my genetics, essential hypertension. And, it's something that I take seriously, because I also, try to combat my own, blood pressure elevations and keeping my blood pressure under control. And so I really do a lot that I personally can do to keep my levels in check. So one of the most important things that I've done is really reduced the intake of sodium. And the first place I had to look was the nutrition label of everything that's in the freezer, everything that's in the fridge or cabinet that was processed. And, we are on a mission to make the majority of the foods that we eat here as a family whole food, majority plant-based diet. My wife and child, still eat meat like chicken, rarely beef, mostly just chicken. I, for years, was eating only plant-based foods, and then have recently in the last year and a half or so reincorporated fish because of its health benefits, and also because it confers a good variety to the meals that I consume now. But I just try to make an effort that the things that are prepared, the things that we eat are mostly prepared at home. And when you prepare them yourself and they're whole food ingredients, you have the control over how much sodium goes into what you eat. And you can really, take note of, even, simple things just have so much sodium content. And I think Americans are guilty of eating in excess of, I would say 7, 8, 10 grams, of salt a day, which is extraordinary. So, high blood pressure and salt especially are things that are near and dear to me.
Yeah, I can actually reason with that, obviously, because I'm a podiatrist and I work in the diabetic foot clinic. So for me, that's like cardiovascular disease is the number one associated disease with diabetes. So I've got to work with some of the best vascular surgeons and kind of, I always try to keep up to date with the literature, new changes in that. And I had a colleague, a senior colleague of mine, who basically had a mini stroke. He was probably 56, late 50s. And he was shocked because he had a healthy lifestyle. He used to cycle, like for the last 25, 30 years, he used to cycle on evenings, weekends. But he had it in the family. His dad he actually suffered from cardiovascular disease. He had a heart bypass. And then, so he they found out it was hereditary. So, and again, he looked kind of healthy, a white, he's a Caucasian 56-year-old. So he was kind of shocked himself because it's usually cardiovascular disease associated with certain ethnic backgrounds, Asian, Black, but yeah, you just never know. It can affect anyone. So I can kind of reason with you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think other than carbon monoxide, which is the famous silent killer, high blood pressure is the other famous silent killer because people don't realize that it's not all nurture. It's also nature when it comes to high blood pressure. I mean, you can live a relatively very healthy lifestyle. You might be active, go biking or exercise, and you don't smoke ever, minimize alcohol, and you still might have high blood pressure. And that mainly could be driven by your genetics. And so it's really important, not only to have your yearly annual checkup and know what your blood pressures are, especially as you become more middle-aged and more senior as an adult, but it's also important to take a very close look at how you're eating every single day. And, even me personally, who for years, I am in the pursuit of optimum nutrition and health, I had to take a look at my pantry and my refrigerator and realize that there were so many things that I was still doing wrong. And, you live and you learn, and you learn more things every single day. And I think there's always a way to do a little bit better. And if, and that's actually exciting because, if you figure something out and, nothing changes for the rest of your life, I think that could be a very boring and dull life where you're not continuously learning. And so I learn something every day and try to improve myself every day. And that gives me something to look forward to because I want my next year to be healthier than my current year, and so on and so forth.
Another thing is with fish, because there was a documentary on Netflix. I can't remember the name, but I'll probably put it on here, and it actually went through the aspects of fish within the world of how much mercury content was in there, and the association between fish and cancer. There was a strong link, and we even had Tony Robbins, a motivational speaker, who was on a documentary, who actually said because he has a house in one of the Fiji Islands, and for 1 year he was consuming a lot of fish, and he actually found that he had a blood test, and he had a high, I think it was a mercury content. It was almost like on the poisonous level where he could have it would have been fatal, and it shocked him. So, and then he said he just stopped eating fish, and I think that's one of the problems: farmed fish versus fish that is fishermen get from the sea. I think that's one of the big problems. You don't know what's in your fish.
Yeah, I think maybe you're talking about Seaspiracy. I think that might be the film.
I believe that's the name. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, that's one thing that people maybe they don't realize about fish is that while most fish are so healthy for you, there are certain varieties of fish that tend to harbor more mercury in their flesh and in their bodies because they accumulate it over time, over years. Mercury naturally exists in the oceans. It drifts into the water and then it gets converted into the water to another form of mercury that the fish pick up because they are sea eaters. They eat within the sea. And so as that mercury accumulates over the fish's lifespan, when we, catch, cut, cook, and prepare our fish, we are ingesting, that elemental mercury that they have. And so, this is why, it's probably, there are some FDA recommendations in terms of the allowance of how much fish to eat when you're pregnant or breastfeeding and so on and so forth. And, absolutely, there's, the higher the mercury, the more deleterious the effect. And, certainly eating, small amounts of it in the more quote unquote healthier varieties of fish, would minimize the amount of mercury you have because your body will excrete it. It doesn't happen immediately. But it does happen over time. So your body does a good job of excreting your mercury, but it can take some time. And so if you're eating excessive amounts of, mercury heavy fish, then it could be a problem. Now, what I could tell you from the things that I've researched over time, and this is certainly not, stuff that you learn in medical school, but this is just out of my own interest, is that, for people who don't know, the larger the fish variety, the higher the mercury. And that has to do not only with the fish's body mass, but also because large fish varieties tend to live longer in the sea. So, and they consume other fish with mercury levels. So, if you think about it like shark, which hopefully not a lot of people are eating, but swordfish, which is really popular and quite tasty. I used to love eating swordfish until I started learning more about this. Swordfish is one of the highest mercury levels in a fish. And that's because swordfish are huge. The same thing with marlin, which I've only had once, just incidentally. Tuna is another culprit, more so the, mahi-mahi or like large tuna steaks as opposed to like the light, albacore, like canned tuna, which still has some, but not as much, let's say, as like the, large ahi steaks. So eating certain types of fish confers less of mercury into the body. So that's why we should stick with things like, salmon, tilapia, which is interestingly, it's all farmed. And, that's a whole nother discussion and debate. It's about farmed versus wild, but, farm may not be as bad as everybody once thought it was when it comes to fish, but tilapia has one of the lower mercury concentrations, as does, I believe, sardines, and mackerel. So, I think mackerel, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's actually a whole list on the FDA website where they continuously, upload all the information about which fish mercury levels are rising and which are dropping and what they are currently. So, I recommend people use that as their reference. But, not all fish are created equal, I guess, when it comes to their health content.
And it's difficult as well. Like I remember reading articles on this, and I think the same applied in the UK and the US, where particularly in the US, they don't have to state if it was farmed or if it was wild. So then if you don't know where it's from, that can be quite difficult. But I think there's always other places that actually specialize in selling fish and they label them, and obviously they cost more. But do you reckon farm is better than wild, in your opinion?
I used to have a strong opinion about this, and I used to only seek out wild because it felt more natural to just have wild fish. But I think the more I look into it, and I don't know if I have, a very clear answer on this yet, to be fair, but the more I look into it, the more I realize that there, with certain varieties of fish, it doesn't really matter. And sometimes farmed could be better. As I alluded to before, tilapia, which is actually a relatively cheap variety of fish. It's, it's good in protein. It's not too high in fat. Tilapia is actually, I think, mostly farmed, as opposed to wild. I don't know if you can get wild tilapia. And it's actually one of the lowest, mercury concentrations in a fish that you purchase today. Salmon is one of the more popular where you can have both wild and farmed. And I think that there's I don't think that there's that much of a difference. Sometimes the farmed actually might carry less mercury. In terms of wild versus farmed, I don't know if I have a strong opinion or a good answer for people on that one, but I wouldn't discriminate too strongly about it.
Yeah. I suppose it's just difficult to actually distinguish, because it depends where it's farmed, how they're farming it, what they're putting into the lake, how they're looking after the fish. If it's tilapia, you said it's got a low mercury content. So that's something I might probably look into myself.
Yeah, I mean, there was one video that I made about foods that I would never eat as an emergency physician, and this got a lot of views and a lot of hate when it came to what I said about oysters, because I used to have oysters. I've definitely gotten sick from it once or twice, but I used to love going to get oysters, and the last several years I just stayed away because I started to learn more and more about it as I saw more people coming in with seafood poisoning, and oysters are filter feeders. They, filter out from the bottom of the ocean and from the bottom of the water that they reside in, usually like, I think, brackish water near coastal areas. And they concentrate, certain bacteria species like Vibrio, which is harmful. And people argue with me and say, well, farmed is better than wild, and most that we eat now are farmed. So when you look at the literature, even the farmed varieties still have concentrations that could be dangerous of Vibrio. It's just, in many settings, it's less, but it's not negligible. And it also depends, like you said, not all farming is created equal. Some people farm their oysters high up, and some people farm their oysters low down. And if it's the lower down variety, that accumulates more Vibrio. So yes, a lot of, just slapping a label doesn't necessarily, negate the practices that they might have. So not everything is created equal in that context.
Yeah. And just to finish that topic, I mean, it's just that there's evidence which points out that eating fish, which is part of the Mediterranean diet, can help reduce cardiovascular disease. But again, I think Mediterranean diet is another topic on its own, because there's a lot of controversy behind it. If it affects the population just in the Mediterranean only, does it behave the same to people who live in other countries? The source of the fish, there's so much into that just a Mediterranean diet is just going to be a podcast on its own. That'd probably be an hour or something debating and looking at evolution.
I think I'll just mention one thing very quickly on it, is that we have to realize that it's a term that gets thrown around loosely, and Mediterranean can be interpreted as pasta and meatballs. And that's really not where Mediterranean diet originates from. It's a mostly plant-based diet, rich in a lot of produce, vegetables, legumes, nuts, olive oil, which these are great sources of fiber, the plants and olive oils and nuts as in terms of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, which replace a lot of animal fat. So, eating like large veal chops and beef, was not a staple of the original Mediterranean diet that we think of, that comes, from the blue zones where people live to be about 100 and live healthy, long lives. So it's really simple. The more you look into proper nutrition and healthy diets, it all boils down to predominantly plants, getting some animal protein, but in moderation, with a heavier weight on fish like salmon, and consuming enough unsaturated fats from things like nuts and oils and legumes, which will improve heart health and your brain health, as opposed to heavy saturated fats, which might actually downstream with a diet that's heavy in saturated fats can lead to disease.
Yeah, definitely evidence on some of those legumes which you can lower cholesterol. We've seen evidence-based studies on those specific ones. So just moving on energy drinks. I remember because you put a video on drinks that you would avoid. One of them was like a drink called Bang. And I know there are a lot of people who love that drink because they go, it doesn't have any sugar in there, but then it's got so much caffeine.
Yeah. So one of the things that I regret is, much against the advice of my brother, who, does a lot of social media, just because that video had so much feedback from viewers in terms of their absolute appalled reactions about me, saying anything bad about energy drinks, or people who are just mortified that I thought kombucha wasn't, a good drink. I unfortunately, I had to take that video down because I thought that, because I wanted to, keep my, integrity as a physician and stay true to my word. I didn't want people to spin things out of control and out of context and see it as misinformation or take advice improperly. But, energy drinks in general, and especially ones like Bang, they have so much caffeine. I think some of them have upwards of 400 milligrams in a single can. And that is about the entire recommended daily allowance for an adult. And when you think about energy drinks and how they're formulated, they're made to go down easy. So a cup of coffee can last you, half an hour. You drink it slowly. It's hot. Sip it slowly. It's bitter. Of course, we're talking about black coffee, not like creamer and sugar. But it's bitter, it's hot, it goes down slowly over social, occasion. Whereas a Bang energy drink, people are drinking those rapidly. They're doing it in a sense to, wake themselves up and get some energy. And unfortunately, other than just a high dose of caffeine that comes in a short period of time, which is typically your maximum daily allowance for a full 24 hours, it also has tons of sweeteners, sometimes sugar, artificial sweeteners, which, that's a whole nother discussion, but, they have tons of sugar. They have other additives that are either caffeine, potentiators like taurine or, guarana, which is actually broken down into a substance basically like caffeine or yerba mate and all those things. So you're actually getting more than the 400 milligrams. So, that's where I see the danger in energy drinks. And that's why I heavily discourage them in the video. But the truth of the matter is so many people buy and drink them and love them and swear by them that it just was not well received. And, I just didn't want any more misinterpretation and I ended up taking it down. But, I get patient, people don't believe it, but I do see people coming in who are extremely tachycardic, people who are having palpitations that were severe enough to bring them to the emergency department, people who feel severely anxious, or people who withdraw when they stop taking them. Because that's the other downside of energy drinks, is because they go down so smoothly, people drink more than one a day. Sometimes they'll drink like 2, 3. And what I find the worst part of it all is that they're really they're marketed and tailored towards younger consumers, like teenagers and kids. And, I think, somebody in high school should not be drinking, energy drinks and getting like 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine in one shot, and then drinking another one in the afternoon to stay awake, and then another one when they're out with their friends. I feel like it could create a dangerous pattern, and that's what I don't like about them, and that's why I touted it as one of my worst drinks from the standpoint of an emergency physician, because I've seen people come in because of energy drinks, and there were plenty of people who chimed in and agreed, but I just. Maybe it's me being self-conscious or just having this need for, maintaining an integrity as a physician, but I just ended up taking it down because I felt like people were saying a lot of things that were false or misleading in a comment section. And, sadly I had to remove it. Maybe I might do another one and revise it and just be a little bit clearer, about what I'm trying to say. Same thing with the salt and the high blood pressure, might just have to put another one of those up there. We'll see.
Yeah. And caffeine's a whole new subject because there's companies that sell caffeine drinks, coffee beans. People love that. And when you talk about caffeine, talking about the cons of caffeine, people get angry, they were like, because it's always changing in the news. I remember a few years ago, they were like saying, don't drink too much coffee because of caffeine. It's bad for you. And then a year later, the same newspaper publishes a article on the benefits of coffee. It's always like swinging back and forth. And I grew up actually, where I actually thought caffeine, especially drinks like Red Bull, were kind of dangerous for you, because I had an uncle who was a doctor. And I remember going into a shop with him. I must have been 15 at the time. So a lot of kids were drinking Red Bull. It was like the cool new drink to drink. And I remember getting it from the fridge, and my uncle was like saying, no, you're not having that. That's dangerous. That can cause heart problems. And that kind of scared me. And I never drank Red Bull, I think, until I was like 19 or 20, almost like drinking alcohol.
I think what people don't realize, and this is this is what's frustrating when I post something like this, is that you have a lot of non-medical people who speak out against me for saying that. But what they don't realize is that, when I see a patient who comes in with palpitations, one of the first things we, go through is, what are they drinking? Are they having tons of coffee? Are they having energy drinks? Because the first thing the cardiologists will tell you is cut out all caffeine when people have arrhythmias like AFib or, palpitations for other reasons. And, it's just frustrating because people say things like, I've been drinking these for years and I have no problem. But you can't take your own anecdotal evidence as gospel. And maybe you will have a problem later on. It's hard to say, but, the point of the matter is, and, this is kind of the difficult part of doing posts like this, is that there's a lot of people who swear by their energy drink, and just will completely call you out on it, no matter what your credentials or background. The other downside is that people will do things like Red Bull vodka, right? So Red Bull itself doesn't have as much caffeine as some of the other energy drinks, but it has sugar, it has additives, and then people mix it with things like alcoholic vodka, and they're becoming more and more intoxicated. But the stimulation from the sugar and the caffeine, gives them a false impression of sobriety because they feel awake and they're not sedated. And so they keep going, they keep drinking, and then they, either get behind a wheel, God forbid, or, they just get alcohol toxicity and other things. So, it is a potent thing, right? It could be used for good and bad, and a lot of it is used for bad sometimes.
Interesting. It kind of masks the effects of being of alcohol, basically, of being impaired. It kind of wakes you up. So then we mix it together. You don't feel impaired, but your alcohol in your blood could be quite high, above the amount for driving. So that could be quite dangerous. They're also interesting. Caffeine's a drug, but it's legal to sell it. It comes in coffee. That's something that kind of hit me because it can cause sort of harm. But is it essential?
It is a drug. I mean, it's a stimulant. It's a drug, but it's
stimulant.
Yeah. It's widely accepted. It's the most popular drug in probably in the world, right? I mean, everybody drinks caffeine, even from an early age. But it doesn't carry the same negative connotations as, let's say, illicit drugs do, right? And sometimes for obvious reasons. But, caffeine, while it does have benefits, but usually in moderation, and it also has harms because in excess amounts, it can cause serious health issues, both in the short and long term. So yeah, it is. I mean, it's plain and simple. It's a drug. It's a stimulant, but, we all do it. I mean, it's in tea. I mean, I don't drink coffee. I haven't had coffee since 2018 because I used to drink excessive amounts. And again, I'm not a hypocrite. The opinions that I give on TikTok are not only based on evidence-based medicine, but also on personal experience, not only with my practice, but also with myself. And I used to drink tons of coffee because I used to work all overnight shifts. And that's how I would stay awake, is I would drink, 5-6 shots before a shift. And I would literally be suturing somebody's face or arm and my hands would be shaking. And that was, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back. And I decided I need to stop this. I mean, it was getting like withdrawal headaches and anxiety and racing thoughts and all kinds of badness, and started to see what all the literature was touting. And so, I get caffeine from green tea and black tea, but it's minuscule compared to the amount of caffeine you get from, like a large coffee or, God forbid, an energy drink. That's a lot more. So a little caffeine is fine. And there are some health benefits to it, but I think it's that people do it in excess. And that's where we start to get into trouble.
Yeah. So I had like a House MD moment there with the caffeine.
Oh, yeah.
But I stopped as well in 2019, actually. And what I found when I started going into my clinic, I was very tired because I was used to drinking coffee in the morning. And that kind of kept me awake. I would come in, when you're starting with your first patient. And then after a month of not drinking coffee, you kind of get addicted to it. Like my body was used to it. It took me at least a month to actually wean off it, to be to a point where I didn't feel tired anymore. Did you go through that same experience when you kind of stopped taking coffee?
Uh, it's hard to say. I mean, I substituted with tea, which has little bits of caffeine. So I wasn't in complete withdrawal, per se, but I definitely, like, in the beginning, I might have felt it a little bit. I'm having a hard time. Remember, it's now 4 years, but I think in the early stages, even though I was still getting some caffeine, I think there was a little bit of some withdrawal to it because I didn't feel as stimulated and energized before shifts. And then slowly I started to readjust and I found a new normal. But it's not something that's essential in life. We don't have to have caffeine. But a lot of things have it. And, certain teas, non-herbal teas naturally have it. Yeah, I think that there was like probably a short period of readjustment, when I first stopped drinking coffee. I think the biggest thing that I missed was, despite that I'm not drinking coffee and it doesn't mean I hate it. I actually really like the smell of like freshly brewed coffee. And, I think that there's a certain kind of cool, artistic approach to, going to like a place, that, takes pride in the different styles of brews and coffees that they create with their bean roasting and all that. But, I just know that it was just a little bit much for me. And at this point I've become accustomed to a much lower baseline level of caffeine in a day.
Yeah. And you can also get decaffeinated coffee.
Yeah, it still has a little bit of caffeine, but yes, it's decaf. And I thought about that too. And, maybe just drink some decaf for the sake of, but maybe I have a strong willpower, but I just feel like I don't really need it. It's the same with meat. I don't eat meat. I used to, and, I stopped eating meat about 3 years ago. And one of my favorite things was getting this really, really good fried chicken sandwich. Not every day, obviously, but once in a while I'd get a fried chicken sandwich from this place called Crack Shack down the street. And, it was just so good. But, I think, I used to love steak. I used to get, a really good filet and all those things. But even though on occasion I find myself thinking about it or feeling like I might miss it, I don't think the longing or the yearning for it is that strong. And, I'm pretty much, I feel like I'm maybe over it. I don't know.
That's something that I find quite interesting about eating meat, and because I've been on a high protein diet versus being vegetarian. And then, because I went through that, my wife's vegetarian, so now I don't really eat much meat. It's very rare that I do. But I was just testing my blood sugar levels and I found obviously, it's not in the high range. It's still low, but I found obviously eating a higher protein diet, blood sugar levels were much lower. But when you're on a vegetarian diet, your blood sugar levels are high. And I watched a video on Dr. Berry, I believe his name. He's on YouTube, and he made a video because he was pre-diabetic, and he found that when he went on a carbohydrate diet, which was recommended by, I think, the CDC, and he found that his blood sugar levels were much higher. So what he did was he just went on 100% high protein meat diet, nothing but meat, eggs and sausages in the morning, a steak for lunch, etc., etc. And he found his blood sugar levels went way down. And this is something I found quite interesting because I saw some other doctor on TikTok, who I'm going to do a podcast with next, who talked about the vegan diet didn't work for him. He tried it, but he needed the protein. What about yourself? How did you find, what was your experience from cutting down on eating meat and going into is it a vegan diet that you're on, or?
No, I'm not vegan. I still eat, I've reincorporated fish in the last year or so. I still eat eggs. There's a lot of nutritional benefit from eggs. I don't do dairy, but occasionally, I have a little cheese because I might have, a slice of pizza or something on occasion, something that has a little milk in it, but I don't regularly consume dairy. If there's something that I eat from dairy more often than other stuff, it would be some Greek yogurt. But, not every day. And that's usually low fat or non-fat Greek yogurt. I think that, for me, cutting out meat came from a lot of different ideas that I had about it. Number one was the saturated fat content. I just didn't need that much animal saturated fat. Number two, there are some downsides to, if you watch enough food documentaries about how they process certain meats, and it kind of scares the crap out of you. There's also some sort of like, humanitarian, I guess, component to it about, saving animals, call it what you want, but I'm not a vegan, and, I don't claim to be. I just try to eat majority of my food around plants, and then I incorporate, some animal proteins like egg or salmon, in moderation. But most of the protein that I get comes from things like legumes and tofu. I think those are my staples. And then I'll usually throw in some protein powder because I do go to the gym and exercise. So, my protein requirement's a little bit higher than, somebody on average. But I just make my way around the kitchen without eating any meats or a lot of dairy.
So do you actually have protein shake on a daily basis because your protein demand is quite high, you mentioned?
I mean, it's not super high. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what's the adequate amount of protein you should consume when you work out. The traditional 1 gram per pound of, body weight, or 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. Some people say, about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. I mean, there's so many different varieties of recommendations, but, and I think we're learning more and more about this, but I would probably try to say, so I weigh 190 pounds, and I'm relatively thin. I probably try to get anywhere from 150 to 170, I want to say, grams of protein per day. And, I usually supplement with, at least 1 protein shake a day. And I usually have that after a workout. It's just, I try to get a super clean, either plant-based or whey-based protein. And I mix it with some almond milk and water and throw in some berries and, some other nutritive, supplements like some flaxseed or amla powder, just for cholesterol's sake. And, that's kind of my approach to my protein, but I get the rest of my protein from like eggs and oatmeal in the morning, and I eat nuts and a lot of legumes, stuff like that. Tofu, almost daily. Yeah.
What protein powder do you use? Obviously, it's not sponsored or anything, but just out of curiosity, because I use Gold Standard. You said you use like a plant-based protein powder.
Oh yeah, I guess I should have mentioned. I mean, I definitely have no conflicts of interest. I get no money from anybody. Maybe one day, but right now I take no money from anyone. I've played with a lot of different brands and varieties. So my target, I don't have like one particular brand that I think is the absolute best, but what I generally look for in a protein is I don't want anything that says proprietary blend on it, because I want to know what I'm getting is actually what I'm looking for. So, again, it's not FDA regulated, so they can say whatever they want. But there are certain companies that try to stay, whole and integral to their word. And so, Legion is a company that is run by, I think, a guy named Mike Matthews. And, his whole, sort of motto is to give you a pure, clean approach to the supplements that you would use for your workout. So Legion, is a great company that I have liked, over the years, and they have a pretty clean whey protein. They also have plant-based stuff. For plant stuff, I think I use, Garden of Life is a pretty good one. And, Vega Sport has a little more protein than traditional Vega. Those are pretty good. But what's most important for me is that it's not high in sodium. And that's what most people don't realize, is that a lot of protein powders are super high in sodium. I mean, 1 scoop can carry about 300 or more milligrams of sodium. So I try to keep something that I think in the entire serving, whether it's 1 or 2 scoops, wouldn't be more than, let's say, about 180 to 200 milligrams of sodium, if that. And I would want it to be pure, whatever it is. So either pure pea protein. So Naked is a good company. I think they have like a pretty simple ingredient list. Legion is pretty simple ingredient list. So the less ingredients, the better, and the less sodium, the better. That's kind of the general approach that I used for my protein powders. Less ingredients and less sodium.
Yeah, and I kind of share the same view on you, because that kind of scares me too, because you don't know how the chicken's prepared. Obviously, I try not to eat the skin of the chicken, because that's where a lot of the chemicals sit on. But yeah, you don't, especially in the US, I read some chicken is actually prepared in chlorine, which is kind of crazy because obviously chicken in the UK was prepared differently. They had different standards and regulations. So for me, that kind of scares me because the long-term consumption of the chicken and the chemicals within antibiotics. And I think on that basis, it kind of makes sense to kind of cut down on me. And when I was growing up, my mother would always kind of criticize me and my brother if we ate quite a lot of meat during the week. And she would kind of like say, you need to cut down. So it would probably be 2 or 3 times in a week. But then I kind of found, just like yourself, if I cut down on meat and I go more into a vegetarian diet, then I'm relying on protein shakes for protein mainly. And how's that going to affect my health in the long term?
I think that we kind of overestimate how much protein we actually need. I don't think it's as high as, some people say, oh, you need 2 grams people are like, oh, I eat like 300 grams of protein a day. And I think that's just too much and unnecessary. I think, if you do 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, so even though I'm 190, I think my lean body mass is probably more like, maybe 170, 160 something. I don't know. But, I don't think I need that much protein. And even then, I think getting 160, 170 grams of protein is probably more than enough. It just depends on which source you're using and who you're getting the information from. But it's probably not as high as we think it traditionally was stated to be. I'd probably be just as fine with about 140 to 150. Do we have firm evidence for that? Not exactly, but there is some science out there, and there are journals devoted to bodybuilding and exercise fitness. And they do experimentation with, protein consumption. And I think that in general, what I've seen as a trend is that it's usually not as high as we think it is.
Yeah. I mean, is your goal now to be more lean, or what was your kind of goal? Were you trying to stay in shape, or were you just trying to focus more on health? And
yeah, I mean, it used to be just get as big as possible. I wanted to be, like super muscular and huge. And there was a time before I stopped eating meat where I was just working out like 6 days a week and eating tons and tons of meat every day, usually lean varieties like turkey breast and chicken breast. But I was upwards of nearly 200 pounds and pretty big and strong. But I think the more I do outdoor stuff now, like I try to surf as much as I can, and carrying a larger frame can be, malproductive for that. So my goal now is I probably, may want to put on a little bit more muscle mass on, but I just try to keep it lean, no more than about, 10 to 12% body fat if I can help it. And that's actually pretty lean as is. And, I think that's kind of the goal, is to incrementally improve my flexibility and my mobility while continuing to put on a little bit of muscle on. But going over 200 pounds is probably no longer my goal. I may want to add a couple more pounds of muscle. But
how tall are you?
I'm 6 foot.
6 foot. That's quite good, actually, because obviously the taller you are, the BMI index, you need to keep that kind of. I'm 5'11", and I think I'm like 170 pounds. But I fluctuate quite a bit, because now I'm working out more. So I kind of lose a bit of weight, the more you work out. I find it kind of difficult to get that kind of balance with the protein and carbohydrates to a point where I've just kind of given up on that, but just focus on a healthy kind of lifestyle, working out, eating as healthy as you can. I think as you get older, that's more of the kind of goal.
I think the easy part is going to the gym. Everybody knows how to go to the gym. It's just the hard part where people fall short is the nutrition part, which is why I've taken so much interest in it over the years, because I've been working out for years. And, 70%, 75% of your results come from the kitchen and not from the gym.
Yeah, I had a discussion with Dr. Ides. He's a big TikTok doctor from the UK who makes his videos on stitches and facts, and he actually mentioned, because he used to be quite big, and he said his goal is not to be big anymore, because as he's getting much older, it's more about health, flexibility, and being able to move more. And I remember looking on his Instagram, some of his earlier pictures, he was very big, and now he's just like doing more cardiovascular exercises. But muscle mass and weight training is actually quite important, even for people who have diabetes, because it helps control your blood sugar levels. It regulates it much better, evidence has shown, compared to doing cardiovascular exercises.
Yeah, I think, resistance training is very important for your, it's important for cardiovascular, but it's super important for your bones and joints. And I think a combination is the best, to do resistance training with weights, as well as, cardiovascular training, such as, whether it's swimming or, jogging or, bike riding, whatever it might be. I think, a combination of the two is probably the best way in terms of achieving, your optimum health, for a sustainable lifestyle. Because if you look at some of the bodybuilders, I should say a lot of the bodybuilders, who are competitive, it's not sustainable. Not many of them can live in that same lifestyle beyond their 40s, 50s, 60s. A lot of them, either stop training to that extent and lose a lot of their muscle mass, or some of them keep trying to do it and they're riddled with injuries. I mean, look at Ronnie Coleman, who is one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time, versus a guy like Dorian Yates, right? Like Dorian Yates was the guy who brought that bigger frame to bodybuilding. And if you talk to him now, I mean, he's got so much wisdom. I love listening to podcasts with Dorian Yates because he completely transitioned. He got hurt really badly, because he overdid it. And as he got older and, continued to compete, he, had so many, injuries, and he decided to retire from bodybuilding, and he lost so much weight. He lost so much muscle, and he feels like he's in such great shape and does things that he wished he did when he was younger. He does a lot of yoga. He does a lot of functional and mobility training, and he's just so happy with it. And it's the wisdom that he tries to impart on people now, from his standpoint. And, I'm kind of tuning myself into that more and more, because I want to be somebody who's in great shape, and in better shape every year of my life, and not just somebody who looks back and says, man, I used to be so fit. I want to be more and more fit every year.
You might not look muscular, but you might be quite healthy. And I think one of the visions that I have is to be more like an athlete, because that's my natural kind of, that's where I am naturally. Like, no matter how big I try to get, I'd only be able to hold that frame for such a long time where it would just get smaller and smaller, and plus it would get slower. Because I run quite a lot. I used to be a sprinter myself, and I find the aspect of health sits on the boundaries of, you've got to look at yourself from 10 years from now. Where do you want to be? Because things change, it depends where you are in your life. And one thing I just wanted to touch upon was, I don't know what the evidence is of weight training on cardiovascular exercise, but I just presume because you're pumping more blood into your muscles, where you have a lot of vessels that sit next to them, that perhaps you might get more nutritious blood coming into your nerves and other vessels as you pump the muscle. I haven't looked too much into that, but I just kind of thought about the aspect of weight training on that, because I think a lot of people are tied too much more into cardiovascular working out. And it's just like now just research coming to play.
I mean, there's definitely a benefit, to resistance training when it comes to cardiovascular health. I'm just not sure how it compares in terms of which is better. I would assume it would be, cardiovascular health is more readily achieved with more, I would say like anaerobic training, aerobic training. But there's definitely benefit to lifting weights and getting into the gym. I think that, anything can be overdone, right? Like you can overdo it with weights and hurt yourself. But if you do a I think, again, achieving the best results probably comes with a combination of the two.
Yeah, definitely warming up beforehand can have a dramatic impact on reducing injury.
Yeah, always warm up. I never just start lifting heavy. I always ramp up to, the level of weight that you want to achieve as a goal for that day. Because it could be deleterious to try to lift up heavy weights on a cold joint and cold muscle. You want to get blood flowing. And I think the best way to warm up is actively and not stretching. Stretching itself is good. And I do it at the end of my workouts. I stretch my, joints and ligaments and muscles, but, the warm up for lifting and being active in the gym is usually dynamic for me. It's, high knees, running in place, jumping jacks, doing the actual exercise with very lightweight, and doing that for multiple sets, ramping up to the target goal of weight. Warm up is essential.
Definitely. So we've come towards the end of the podcast. Are there any 3 wisdoms of advice or tips you can leave the listeners?
Wow. Three tips of advice. I guess if we were to reflect on our conversation today, some important pearls or take-home points, everything in moderation, is really important, right? So a lot of things are, the reason there's so much conflicting data on things is because in moderation, they may be really beneficial, but in excess, they may not. So enjoy life and do things that you eat and do things that you enjoy, but, always think about moderation. Don't eat too much salt, because salt is highly correlated to, cardiovascular disease. And I want everybody to live happy and fruitful lives, and developing high blood pressure and heart disease is horrible. So lowering salt intake, doing everything in moderation. And, I think making sure that everything you do has a purpose behind it, because when you have a purpose behind it, it'll motivate you more and you'll do it in a sustainable fashion, and you'll actually see results. And that reflects back to what we talked about in terms of studying. Having a why and a reason for doing that will get you better results. And I think that, for me, going to the gym, it's very hard some days to go to the gym, but if you have a strong passion and a reason why you're going to the gym, it'll keep you motivated and it'll keep you in better shape. And I think those are 3 important things that I would take away from this. So I hope that helps.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on, Dr. Rose. It's been a fascinating podcast that we've had today. Thank you so much. And I hope we could probably do this in the future sometime as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.